Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to be talking about disks, and specifically we're going to talk about how to partition disks on our system. Now, during the installation process for any version of Linux that you are installing, you had to go through a process by which you partitioned the drive to accept the installation. Now, that's all fine and good, and it uses a GUI-based partitioning tool for the most part, although you can run command line. It prompts you through the process. However, what happens if you add a disk post-installation that you need to partition? Well, the easy way to do it is to use a GUI tool called gpartd. And it is available for every Linux distribution, Debian-based or RPM or Red Hat-based, and it's just called gpartd. So if you are running, for example, in our case, we're running a CentOS system, so all I would do is install gpartd, which is the GNOME partition editor. In my case, I already have it installed. You have to run it from the command line or from within your menu system, but it has to be root or run with sudo privileges in order to see the physical drives in the system. So if I run gpartd, it'll scan my system, and I can actually partition, format, etc., all right within here. That's great, except for that's cheating, and from a system perspective, it doesn't really teach you a whole heck of a lot simply because it does all the work for you. So what we're going to start with here is we're going to start with assuming that we're not running inside of a GUI, and we're going to run at the command prompt, and we're going to use the traditional command line tools for partitioning our drive. And then later we'll format it and then mount it on boot. So in order to see what I have on my system, if my system is detecting disks other than my OS, which if I do a df-h, I see that dev SDA 1 and 3 are already formatted and mounted on my system. So any other disks might be either HDA or will be SDB, SDC, etc., etc. I need a utility that will tell me what's on my system. Well, fortunately, in terms of that, we use a utility that anybody who's ever used DOS before is familiar. So we run a sudo command and we do fdisk. Now, if we do an fdisk-l, it will simply list all of the available disks on my system. So if I do a fdisk-l, and I scroll up here to the top, I see that I have a disk called dev-sda, which is about 140 gigabytes in size, and it has these physical characteristics. It also has these particular partitions that are this type. There's both an ID and a description that says that SDA1 is Linux, SDA2 is my swap file, SDA3 is also Linux. However, it also sees a dev SDB, which is a gigabyte in size. There doesn't appear to be any partition-based information here. I see a dev SDC, also a gigabyte in size, no partition information. And I see a dev mapper Docker. Docker happens to be installed. It's on the root partition, and it detects about 107 gigabytes of size. It's a virtual disk. So what I'm interested in is these two unpartitioned drives called dev SDB and dev SDC. Well, now I know what I want to do is I want to fdisk these and set them up with a particular type and format of partition. So I can do that with a sudo fdisk and then dev SDB. Device contains neither a valid disk partition nor sun, SGI, etc., etc. And the reason being is because there's nothing been done to this table yet. In fact, if I print out, I get the same information that I got during the fdisk-l. It tells me the characteristics of the drive, the size of the drive, but there aren't any partitions. And you can see that because there's no device boot, start, end, blocks, etc. Now, if I hit the M key, it will tell me these are the things that I can do. Toggling a bootable flag, adding a disk label, DOS compatibility, deleting a partition, list known partition types. Aha, let's start with that. What are those partition types? Well, if we go and we look at 82 is Linux swap and 83 is Linux. Those are the types of partitions that we're interested in. So if we go back to M, we listed those partition types that we saw on SDA 1 and 3. But what we want to do is we want to add a new partition. So again, we're in the dev SDB and we want to add a single partition. So let's add one partition. And if I look in my help list, I have N for adding a new partition. So let's add a new partition. We're going to make it either extended or primary. Now, primary partitions will be the first partition or the primary partition or bootable partition on a disk. Extended means that you can have many subpartitions. In this case, we're just going to choose primary, and it's going to ask us for a partition number. This is the first partition, so we're going to say number 1. The first cylinder is where does this disk start? I want it to start at the beginning since that's the default. I'll leave it. And then the last cylinder or size is here, and I can do the size in K, M, or G. So K would be kilobytes, M megabytes, G gigabytes. In this case, the default is 130, which will make my disk the entire size of all cylinders available on the disk, which is just a gigabyte in this case. So I'm going to choose default of 130 by just pressing enter, although I could, for example, say plus size 500M, which would give me a 500 meg partition, and then I'd have additional space for a secondary partition. In this case, I just want to leave it as default. Now, I'm back to the M, so if I go back to M, remember before we printed the partition table. So let's look at what our partition table looks like now. So dev SDB1 starts and ends at the full size of the disk, and it's a gigabyte in size. That's great. Now I've got this partition. Now, you can't just exit from here. You have to actually write the data to the disk. So we're going to verify the partition table by hitting V, and then we're going to write the table to disk and exit. Now, let's clear the screen. If I just do a sudo fdisk-l on dev SDB, I'll see that now, rather than leaving this blank, which listed all of my disks, I did on dev SDB, I now have a single partition that is SDB1, taking the full size of the disk. Now, again, I have the ability to create multiple partitions on the disk. So, for example, if I do a sudo fdisk, I'm not going to pass any parameters in here, but I'm going to say dev SDC. If I print the table, I see that there's nothing there. We go back to M. We're going to add a new partition. We're going to create a primary partition. We'll leave it as partition 1. The first cylinder is fine. The last cylinder, however, what's half of 130? Well, it would be 65. So let's just leave 65 in here. Now I'm going to print that partition, and it will tell me the start is 1, the end is 65, and it's the Linux file system. Now I want to go back to my help, and I want to add a new partition. We'll also create a primary partition, but it's now number 2. The first cylinder would be 66, and the default of 130 would be the end. So I'm creating 2 partitions. And again, I can use size if I want, but in this case, I'm letting I know it's a 1 gig drive, 130 cylinders in length. So if I want 2 partitions equal to 500 megabytes approximately, I go between 1 and 65 and then 66 and 130, and that gives me about that much information. So if I hit a P, then I do a dev SDC1, dev SDC2, and then I verify the partitions, and then I write to the disk. Now, again, if I clear, I can do a sudo fdisk-l for dev SDC, and I should see that I have 2 partitions, dev SDC1, dev SDC2, and again, verifying what we did to the SDB gives us 1 partition. So now we have 2 disks that have a combined 3 partitions, and right now we can't copy any files to them, we can't mount them because we haven't actually formatted them, which we'll do in a subsequent video. But for formatting our disks within our Linux operating system using the fdisk command at the command prompt, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.